Hello, everyone. My name is Delia. I am Achuta's assistant, and Achuta is still recovering from his surgery, so he's asked me to take over hosting duties for today's talk. This is the third and last talk of our Winter 2022 speaker series. We are very happy to have Dr. Peter Yong joining us today, whom I will introduce in just a second. But before that, I wanted to say a few words about the Nightlight speaker series itself, which is a program that has been going on at Nightlight Astrology for more than 10 years already. Achuta hosts 12 guest speakers on the year, 3 per zodiacal season. And the purpose of the speaker series talks is to expose Achuta's students or the Nightlight students to a wider range of astrological voices and concepts than what they only experience in class. And then also the second goal is to make quality astrology education more accessible to the public and people at large. Taking courses can be expensive, going to conferences can be expensive, even purchasing lectures on astrologers' websites can be expensive. Not everyone can spend $25, $30 to purchase one recording, or even if you can, I know some of us want to hoard 100 recordings and it gets expensive fast. So we offer this series of talks, which is completely free and open to the public. And we're able to do this also recently, thanks to the success of the Kickstarter campaign and the generous support of everyone who contributed to that project. Thanks to that, we are able to offer our speakers a very generous speaker's fee, which is actually above the average of for these kinds of talks, and to be able to support also new and upcoming voices in the astrological community, as well as more well-established guests, and just generally support astrological knowledge in general. At least that's our hope and that's our intention. I would like to share now at this point the overview of what we've covered so far. Peter, can you confirm that the Nightlight website is on the screen, please?
Yeah, it's up there now.
All right, thank you. So this is nightlightastrology.com. If you go to events, speaker series, you can still watch the replay of last weekend's talk given by Jessica Tiemann, who talked about Mars reenactment and reimagination of the divine. This replay is soon to expire on the website, so you definitely want to check that out before Monday. Yesterday, Cassandra Tyndall gave us a really nice talk on houses of meaning and divine inspiration, the 3rd and the 9th houses, and we've received already a lot of positive feedback about that. And today, Dr. Peter Yong is going to be giving us a talk titled Taking Back the Helm, the Metaphysical Grounds of Classical and Contemporary Accounts of the Ascendant. Peter Yong is actually currently taking our year 1 program. He comes to us with a background in philosophy and theology. And I was just asking him before the talk, actually, well, what brought you to astrology? What brought you to the course? And it seems like that metaphysical, spiritual piece had been missing from the more dry academic intellectual environment. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Peter's talk and have him bring in all of his knowledge and his background and give us, enrich us with his perspective. So let me read his biography. Dr. Peter Yong is a philosopher, writer, and nomadic psychopomp. He earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of California, San Diego, and his master's in theology from Fuller Seminary. His previous research has focused on the intersection of German idealism and contemporary philosophy of mind, and his essays have appeared in the European Journal of Philosophy, Kantian Review, History of Philosophy Quarterly, and the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Theology, 1600 to 1800. He is currently writing a book on the phenomenological grounds of Hellenistic astrology. His recent essays and links to his video lectures can be found online on his website, premieritat.com. And you can see his coaching and consulting offers also on that website or directly at this link. Peter, we are so happy to have you here today. And, oh, I'm sorry. Some notes about the chat etiquette before I hand it over. We are going to have the chat box set. I'm having trouble speaking today. I don't know why I'm stumbling over my words. Please feel free to send in reflections or comments on the presentation into the chat box. It will be set to hosts and panelists, so it'll be visible to us, but not to the general public in order to avoid distractions. And if you have questions about the talk itself, there will be a Q&A portion at the end of the talk. And please type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. All right, without further ado, Peter.
Excellent.
Well,
thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I'm really excited to be here and to share this talk with you all. So let me get started and get the slides up. Okay. So let's see, share screen. Okay. Okay. So Delia, can you see this?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Thank you again. I'm really excited to be here. I want to share with you a talk about the Helm or the Ascendant or the first house in astrology and talking about what's called the metaphysical grounds for it, saying that there's a kind of philosophical component to these different astrological doctrines of this one particular teaching. So before we get started with the talk proper, I want to say some things beforehand, just because we're going to be moving through a lot of dense material, and I want to give you a lay of the land. I want to talk about what my main theses are going to be and what I hope the big picture takeaway will be. Okay, so the first thesis I'm going to be arguing for today is that classical and contemporary accounts of the ascendant are not only distinct, they're not only distinct like conceptualizations of this thing, but also when you think them through, they're in crucial respects opposed to each other. Right, so oftentimes when we're talking about different kind of astrological systems, we'll talk about like languages and we'll say, look, it's two languages, but they're talking about the same reality, right? They're talking about the same thing, but there's two different ways of kind of conceptualizing it, right? I'm wanting to suggest that if we look at things carefully, it might end up that a better reading is that we've got two different contradictory conceptions of reality, that these two views aren't really trying to talk about the same thing, or at least like in their own terms. They're not like portraying themselves as talking about the same thing, but they're talking about different things. Or again, for another example, we'll talk about things like, look, you can go to the market by taking a bike or taking a skateboard, right? We've got different tools to get to the same place. And I want to suggest that after a careful reading of these texts, the analogy might be more like, look, I'm planning on going on a vacation. Do I want to go deep sea diving or do I want to go mountain climbing? They're two different activities, and the stuff I'm going to do to prepare for each of these activities is going to be different, right? Okay, so that is thesis one. We're going to have to think about the possibility of choosing between two different conflicting accounts. Thesis two, these different concepts of the ascendant are grounded in even more fundamental differences of worldview. So worldview is just a way of seeing reality, like a total philosophical picture, your way of approaching society or religion or commerce or your friendships, right? It's all encoded in a particular kind of worldview. And I'm wanting to argue that these different astrological concepts of the ascendant are grounded in two fundamentally different kinds of worldview. And we can see it in two particular domains. So the first is going to be the worldviews are going to differ in terms of what social reality is. They're going to offer different answers to the question, what is a society? So on the one hand, the classical view is going to say something like, well, society is a spiritual order that's grounded in an unseen spiritual order and also fits within an order of nature, right? It's this midpoint between this orderly totality. Whereas the modern view tends to approach society as a system of power relations, right? Where it's more like, what rules can be set in place so that we don't murder each other, right? So we don't eat each other alive. How can we make it so that somebody's on top and there's a dominance hierarchy, right? So that's going to be two fundamentally like different ways of like thinking about how society functions or how society should function. And then more importantly, I'm going to argue that these two differences of worldview differentiate in terms of metaphysical reality. So they're going to give different answers to the question of what is God or the absolute or absolute reality. How is that structured? On the one hand, the classical view is going to say something like, it's something that's absolutely good, something that's absolutely determinate, something that's graspable by intellect or reason. Right? Whereas the modern view tends to say the absolute is something that's inherently undifferentiated, something that's always kind of changing, something that's essentially metaphorical, and something that is itself amoral, right? It's not good. It's going to be good and bad and kind of fluctuate between those two kinds of things. So these are going to be like really different kinds of conception about like what the ultimate grounds of reality are. Okay, so those are the two kind of dimensions of worldview that I'm going to be arguing ground the different concepts of the ascendant in Western astrology. Okay, so those are the theses I'll be arguing for. And then the even bigger picture takeaway is I'm hoping that you'll get the sense that we need to be at least as careful in drawing our philosophical distinctions as we are in drawing our astrological distinctions. That there is this rich kind of conceptual repertoire that's been articulated by philosophers that we have to pay attention to when we're working out our astrology. So, for example, right, it's kind of a common trope that classical astrologers are going to freak out when they hear a modern astrologer conflate the meanings of planets, signs, and houses in a so-called 12-letter alphabet, right? So when a modern astrologer says like, well, yeah, first house, that's like Aries and Mars, right? It's all like the same kind of thing. It's all the same kind of like energy. The classical astrologers are going to be like, oh, no, you're missing out on so much. They'll have to like constrain themselves. They're so excited and impassioned about like setting forth these distinctions as being like, no, planets mean one thing, signs have another set of meanings, and houses have another set of meanings. And when you conflate them, you lose the kind of conceptual clarity and richness and power of the astrological tradition, right? So they're in that kind of mode when they're talking about the astrological stuff and the importance of being clear and drawing distinctions. But yet, when it comes to the underlying philosophical commitments of astrology, it's not uncommon for even classical astrologers to uncritically accept claims like the following. Right? So here's some examples from some of the key texts that are used. For example, Heraclitus, a philosopher who claimed that everything's fire, everything's flux, you can never step in the same river twice because it's always changing. Plotinus, a Neoplatonic philosopher who said that everything emanated out from the one. Augustine, a Christian mystic philosopher. Kant, a philosopher of the Enlightenment who wanted to constrain knowledge in order to make room for faith. And Hegel, who argued directly against Kant and said, we can have knowledge of the absolute, and this absolute knowledge articulates itself as a philosophical system. All of these philosophers, it claims in this passage, each held, in their own way, that soul, its depth, imagination, subjectivity, interiority is immeasurable. Measurable norms and souls are incommensurables. Right, so you've got this claim that all of these radically different philosophers are all like saying the same thing, and they're all saying this thing, this kind of like very particular conception of subjectivity that like, well, whatever subjectivity is, whatever the subject is, it could never be determinate, right? It's something that's absolutely indeterminate, and that norms don't apply to it. Okay, here's another, again from Hillman. By calling upon Jung So the depth psychologist of the 20th century. To begin with, I am partly acknowledging the fundamental depth that archetypal psychology owes him. He is the immediate ancestor in a long line that stretches back through Freud, who's another psychologist, Dilthey, a sociologist, Coleridge, romantic poet, Schelling, post-Kantian philosopher, Vico, Italian anti-Cartesian philosopher, Ficino, Renaissance Neoplatonist philosopher, Plotinus, Neoplatonic philosopher, Plato, the arch-Platonist who claims there's an eternal world of forms, to Heraclitus, that pre-Socratic philosopher who said that everything is flux and flow. And with even more branches which have not yet been traced, which have yet to be traced. Heraclitus lies near the roots of this ancestral tree of thought, since he was the earliest to take the psyche as his archetypal first principle, to imagine soul in terms of flux and to speak of its depth without measure. So again, we're seeing like all of these radically different philosophers, they all held to the same claim about the soul and said that it's basically this kind of Heraclitean flux, right? That is something that can't be rendered determinate. Depth psychology, the modern field whose interest is in the unconscious depths of the psyche, that is, the deeper meanings of the soul, is itself no modern term. Depth reverberates with a significance, echoing one of the first philosophers of antiquity. All depth psychology has already been summed up by this fragment of Heraclitus. You could not discover the limits of the soul or psyche, even if you traveled every road to do so. Such is the depth, bathun, of its meaning, logos. Ever since Heraclitus brought soul and depth together in one formulation, so he's saying Heraclitus made this move where soul, like this kind of like what we are essentially, and this depth that can't be measured, this thing that's essentially indeterminate, this indeterminate flux. Once he brought these two together, the dimension of soul is depth, not breadth or a height. And the dimension of our soul travel is downward, right? This is an important thing we'll see throughout the texts that come up. Like, so Hillman is saying that all of these philosophers said the direction of the soul is downward, and it's this kind of incoherent flux. And we'll see in several of our texts that many of the philosophers of antiquity actually saw the soul traveling like upward, right? And the soul having a determinate kind of character it takes on when it incarnates. Okay, so that's the big picture kind of takeaway. I want you to come across passages like this and just, pause for a second and be like, is that true? Are these people all saying the same thing? It might be that Hillman is right, that he's saying something correct about his overall view, but it's just something that needs to be argued for. It's something that needs to be thought about. Or again, if we move into the astrological literature properly, we can see Richard Tarnas with another influential book, Cosmos and Psyche. And he does the same kind of thing here. So right before this paragraph, he'll say, the history of philosophy, it's all about these like conceptual distinctions between these people. But for our purposes, for archetypal astrology, we can define an archetype as a universal principle or force that affects, impels, structures, permeates the human psyche and the world of human experience on many levels. So just right there, I want you to be able to like think through like what is actually being said here, and like what would the different, what is being said when it affects, and that's the same as impels, and that's the same as structures, and that's the same as permeates, and like the psyche and the world of experience, and like on many levels, which levels, right? Just the desire to like really get clear on what's being said. One can think of them in mythic terms as gods and goddesses, or what Blake called the immortals. So romantic poet. Right? In Platonic terms as transcendent first principles and numinous ideas. So Plato, the arch-Platonist, talking about a transcendent world of forms. Or in Aristotelian terms as eminent universals and dynamic indwelling forms. One can approach them in the Kantian mode of a priori categories of perception and cognition. So Kant saying that all people have a necessary structure of experience because they share the same kind of rational faculties to make sense of experience. And that's the same as Schopenhauer, who said that everything's essentially irrational will articulating itself. Schopenhauerian terms as the universal essences of life embodied in great works of art. Or in the Nietzschean manner, Nietzsche, who was a fierce opponent of Platonism, who said that everything was about the will to power, as primordial principles symbolizing basic cultural tendencies and modes of being. In the 20th century context, one can conceive of them in Husserlian terms as essential structures of human experience. So Husserl being one of the first to formulate a 20th century phenomenology, who's very rigorous about finding these like abstract structures that that can allow us to make sense of our experience. That's the same as Wittgenstein, who said that all of metaphysics is basically a language mistake, that all of the philosophical tradition has been misguided just because they got deceived by tricks of language, and that metaphysical problems don't need to be solved, they need to be dissolved by seeing that there are like no problems at all. So these Wittgensteinian terms as linguistic family resemblances, linking disparate but overlapping particulars. In Whiteheadian terms, as eternal objects of pure potentialities whose ingression informs the unfolding process of reality, so kind of process philosopher. Or in Kuhnian terms, he's a philosopher of science who wanted to talk about paradigm change and how that happens between incommensurable theories, that it's not entirely a rational process, as underlying paradigmatic structures that shape scientific research. Finally, with depth psychology, one can approach them in Freudian modes as primordial instincts impelling this and structuring biological and psychological processes. So now we're into the domain of 20th century psychology, says that's where Freud says that there's a personal unconscious that's structuring everything. And all this talk about like reasoning it's kind of like BS, like what's really calling the shots are these kind of brute instincts. Or in the Jungian manner as fundamental formal principles of the human psyche, universal expressions of a collective unconscious, and ultimately of the unus mundus. So this idea that there's a world that's consisting of the archetypes and that this unifies both like the physical world and our kind of mental existence. In a sense, claims Harness, the idea of archetypes is itself an archetype, and arche, a continually shape-shifting principle of principles, right? So you're getting the claim that these people were all saying the same thing. And again, the thing they're saying is that the archetype, the primary like structuring principle, the ultimate reality is a shape-shifting, ever-shifting metaphorical thing, right? With multiple creative inflections and variations through the ages as diffracted through different individual and cultural sensibilities. So again, what I want you to come away with is just the thought that like, we need to think this through, right? We need to think this through. This isn't just a given fact. It might be right. Maybe this is the ultimate principle of reality and it is like this. But on the face of it, it looks like these philosophers are all saying vastly different things. And like, for example, like Plato and Husserl and Kant and Aristotle are all gonna reject this kind of conception of the archetypes. They're gonna say that these kinds of like structuring principles are determinate and rational, okay? So that's what I want you to come away with, the kind of takeaway from today's talk. So with that said, let's move into the subject matter proper. So what I first want to do is lay out what these astrological views of the ascendant are, right? What are these different conceptions of the ascendant in astrology? And basically, if you're new to astrology, the ascendant represents the eastern horizon over which planets step forth into visibility, right? So if you're watching the sunrise, right? You're seeing something beautiful. It's coming up from under the earth and you're seeing the light there. It's beautiful, right? It's like the day is being born, right? It's something magnificent. Well, that horizon line right there, that place where it's coming forth into visibility, that's the ascendant in astrology. And it's represented in the astrological chart here, if you can see my mouse cursor, by this AS mark. It can also be an ASC or an AC, right? Wherever this falls is going to determine the first house. So this chart is using what's called a whole sign house system. So you'll see it's not at the beginning of the house, but it's in there. And wherever this mark falls, it's going to determine the first house. So it defines the first house, or in Greek terms, the first place. And from that, it's going to determine where all the other houses are, right? How they fall out, right? So because this chart, which is supposedly for Freud, the ascendant falls in Scorpio, The next house over, the second house, is going to be Sagittarius, and so on, right? So you get one house, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So the entire structure of this astrological chart is going to be determined by where this point falls, right? What sign this falls in. Okay. So then that's the basic like astrological phenomenon. How did classical astrologers look at this? So in the ancient world, when they looked at this ascendant and the first place that it defines, how would they think of it? And for them, they noted that this point, this ascendant point or horizon, moves rapidly through the zodiac. It's going to change signs about every 2 hours. And as a result, it's something that's most unique to the native, right? This horizon line where things are being born, right? It's moving so frequently that when the native is born there, it's something unique to that individual, right? Whereas if you did something like a sun sign astrology, that's going to be like a lot of people. A lot of people are gonna have that same kind of that same common sign there. So from the ancient point of view, what's most personal about the chart, this kind of like fundamental orienting point, is gonna be the ascendant. And as a result, it came to represent the native's body, like this incarnate body that the soul takes on, the native's life, soul, spirit, all of these kind of fuse together as they determinately incarnate in an empirical world, right? So insofar as soul takes on a particular life and is born into this world and then manifests itself out as a concrete life, that's what the ascendant is going to be talking about. Like it's a determinate incarnation. What is this life about as a human being, right? In the soul's journey. And we can get an analogy for it linguistically in the German concept of Dasein in some philosophical literature. So there, like sein is the word for being, right? It's like general being, being in general, sein. But what is Dasein? Well, Da means there. It's their being, right? It's this determinate being. It's like me being right here in a room, right? Me there in this moment in space and time, right? With a world around me. That's kind of what the ascendant is getting at, right? It's not just general being, it's like determinate being. It's being that then generates a world, like the rest of the astrological chart. It's a being that's surrounded by a world. It's the orientation point for having this world given to it. Okay. So, because on this classical view, the ascendant was associated with the native as a unique being, this first place was designated the helm, right? It's called the helm, and that's the part of the ship that you steer it from, right? So the thought is like how, as you have this world, as this world is given to you, as you've got like money and relationships and like career and sickness, like all of these things you're going to be navigating, like what's the point? Like where's your locus of control in that? Like what is this life being steered from? The idea is like it's being steered from you. It's being steered from your character. It's being steered from like literally like if you want to take it at a bodily level, it's like you're interacting with it with your body. You're like doing stuff. You're like reaching out and grabbing stuff, right? This is the helm. This is how you interact with your world. Right. So the ship of life is steered from the helm, and thus it's the seen as the locus of responsibility and control, right? If you were going to go and get on you thought you were going to take a trip to Athens and it was normal weather, everything was as expected, but you found yourself in Sparta, right? You'd look at the person that was steering the ship. You'd look at the person that had control of the helm and you'd be like, well, what did you do? Why'd you take me here rather than there? It's this point like where the native is embodied as a determinate entity, that a life has this kind of locus, has this kind of power of responsibility and control, right? And because of this schematization, it was associated with the planet Mercury. The first house was thereby associated with Mercury according to the Planetary Joy Schema. It is the place where Mercury rejoices. So Mercury is seen as the planet of reason, right? It's the planet of mind. It's trying to think things through, right? It's dialectic. And as a position of responsibility of control, that helm, it's associated with reason, right? And we can think through this conceptually, right? If you see a child at a store like throwing a tantrum and crying because he or she can't have candy, right? They're crying. you don't hold them responsible. You're like, well, yeah, it's a kid, right? They can't reason. They don't think like, oh, this is a store. It's not an appropriate place to like cry about stuff. Like it's not right, right? They don't have reason yet. But if you saw a full-blown adult there, like crying because they couldn't have candy, then you'd say like, what's wrong with this person? There's something defective about their character, right? Something is up. Or again, we think of it in like insanity pleas in the law, right? Somebody does something and the argument is they shouldn't be held legally responsible. Why? Because they don't have access to reason. They didn't know what they were doing, right? They didn't have the kind of rational faculties that would give them control, right? So there's this conceptual connection between responsibility and control, this ultimate locus of choice, ultimate locus of like how you're going to determine how you're interacting with the world, and reason for the classical mind. Likewise, because it's the horizon, because it's this connecting point of heaven and earth, it's also associated with Mercury as the mediator between worlds. So mythologically, Mercury was seen as a messenger of the gods. So Zeus could, go command Mercury, be like, hey, go tell that nymph to let Odysseus go, right? And then Mercury would go down and send the message, right? So Mercury is seen both as reason and as this mediator between worlds, right? Okay. So again, we can see the conceptual background of this from Plato. We can see a kind of philosophical conception that these astrologers are building from. So this example comes from Plato's Republic, where he introduces the idea of the Philosopher King. So he purports like in building this ideal city, he says like, well, yeah, I think it would run best if like philosophers ruled, if there were like sage kings running society. And his friends would respond with like, dude, that's crazy. That does philosophers, they're useless, right? They want to like go live in a cave. They're not out like politically active. They don't have the political fortitude in order to actually successfully rule. What are you talking about? And Socrates responds to this by offering this analogy to a ship. All right, so he says, imagine then that something like the following happens on a ship or on many ships. The ship owner is bigger and stronger than anyone else on board, but he's hard of hearing, a bit short-sighted, and his knowledge of seafaring is equally deficient. The sailors are quarreling with one another about steering the ship, each of them thinking that he should be the captain, even though he's never learned the art of navigation and cannot point to anyone who taught it to him or to a time when he learned it. Right? So all these people like want power of the ship. They want to be able to control the ship, but none of them believe that there is such a thing as the art of navigation. Indeed, they claim it isn't teachable and are ready to cut to pieces anyone who says that it is. They're always crowding around the ship owner, begging him and doing everything possible to get him to turn the rudder over to them. And sometimes, if they don't succeed in persuading him, they execute the ones who do succeed and throw them overboard. And then, having stupefied their noble ship owners with drugs, wine, and in some other way, they rule the ship, right? So these are really nefarious characters. They want power at all costs, even if it means like drugging the ship owner or like killing their rivals, right? And they think that this is what being a captain is, or being a true navigator is. Moreover, they call the person who is clever at persuading or forcing the ship owner to let them rule a navigator, a captain, and one who knows ships, and dismisses anyone else as useless. So here's the analogy then with politics, right? He's saying like, yeah, all these politicians say like, yeah, the people that like think about like morals and stuff, and think about the ultimate nature of reality, and think about human nature. They claim these people claim it's all useless because they think it's all about just gaining power for themselves, right? Just about like, being the person in charge. Then Socrates claims they don't understand that a true captain must pay attention to the seasons of the year, the sky, the stars, the winds, and all that pertains to his craft, if he's really to be a ruler of the ship. Right? So the idea of like, what makes a good captain, not just somebody that has power, but what makes a good captain is someone that knows the structure of his craft, his or her craft, right? That they know how the weather affects the ship. They know how the ship functions. They know the maps, right? They've acquired this knowledge. They understand reality. That's what actually makes for a good captain or a true captain. And they, the other sailors, don't believe that there is any craft that would enable him to determine how he should steer the ship, whether the others want him to or not, or any possibility of mastering this alleged craft or of practicing it at the same time as the craft of navigation. Don't you think that the true captain will be called a real stargazer, a babbler, and a good for nothing by those who sail in ships governed in that way in which such things happen, right? So the analogy is that, like, well, yeah, if you define politics as like raw power, then of course these people are going to be called useless. But like if we think about like how things actually should work, like how spiritual reality is actually structured, then like knowledge should be important, right? Knowing that spiritual reality. So that's Plato's argument there, and we can see its application for the astrological metaphor in the fact that Plato's defining the captain of a ship as a good captain by the fact he's mastered his craft, the art of sailing, right? What makes someone the helms person, right? It's the place of knowledge. It's a place where Mercury rejoices, right? The place of responsibility and control. He knows the craft and is aware of his surroundings and is able to deal appropriately with the situation. And this should call immediately to mind Mercury's significations, right? So for example, in the classical tradition, we have Valen's definition of Mercury, and he brings in the concept of the logos, right? Of reason, of rationality, right? This is definitional of Mercury. Also of paideia, or education, right? The thought that the captain was taught ship sailing, right? Educating people into knowledge. Phronesis, which is practical wisdom, the kind of wisdom you have not just by learning rules and like, you know, like executing an algorithm, but taking in the entire situation, taking in the totality and just knowing, like having an intuitive sense of like, I've mastered this thing. And I just know, I've just got a practical sense, a practical knowledge of how to steer the ship. And ultimately, Valens associates Mercury with philosophia, right? The ultimate, to Plato's mind at least, conception of a totality of reality, understandings to the spiritual world as a whole, as itself. So Mercury's significations come from an association with the first house, can be grounded in this kind of philosophical background of the time. On this view, being a true captain is not merely a matter of presenting oneself as a captain and persuading others that this is so. So hold on to this idea and this metaphor for when we come to the modern account of the first house, because this ends up being a fundamental definition of the ascendant of the first house on the modern view, is just this kind of like self-presentation and self-persuading, then the persuading of others. Okay. So just some textual evidence for this claim. So I'm not just making a bunch of assertions about what the ancient astrologers said without like having textual evidence for it. Here's a couple of passages. So this is from Paulus. He's in the 4th century, and he says, of the 12 places, so those houses, handed down in relation to every nativity plan, the origin, arche, that source point, and foundation is the horoscopos, right? That ascendant, right? So again, like it's the marker point for the first house, and that's going to define the rest of the world. Hence, it's the origin and it's the foundation of the thing, through which the all concretizing the fortunes of man is grasped, right? We grasp this person's life as a whole, the world as a whole, from this point. For the horoscopos is the giver of life and spirit, whence it is called the helm. Again, this place of responsibility and control. It's the life, it's the spirit. Only the star of Hermes, Mercury, among all the stars. So again, like really pointing out the special connection here, that it's Mercury that's in this place. It is Mercury that rejoices in this place. Right? So there's something really special about the connection to Mercury. Or again, Rhetorius in the 6th or 7th century. This passage is a bit more dense, but let's get through it. The first place is called the one concerning life. And on account of this fact, it is so called. Because after the rising of the house of the bad daimon, this very sign rises. So what's meaning is that like before the current house, that's the first house, had risen, the 12th house, the one above it, had been there beforehand, right? So then that was called the house of the bad daimon. So that bad daimon had been there before and it's moved. This sign is the first house is now there. And after the passing of the climacteric, it is to be examined closely. And the one engendering in the fetus, we're going to look at both the mother and the child at this point. right? Because they both have gone from dangers and darkness into light and life. So you think at this point where the child's born, like, was a time of danger. Maybe the mother would die, maybe the child would die. Both, it was a very critical time, but the child was born. It's successful, right? It's this moving from dangers and darkness into light and life. And it is called the Helm. And we term it the first house because the beginning, again, the arche, this first point, this first principle of the investigation becomes known to mathematicians from there. It's this absolutely critical place in the Hellenistic tradition. And also it is indicative of both spirit and basis. All right? The star of Hermes, again, Mercury, rejoices when it is present in this house because the spirited being was established through the Logos. Again, we get a reason, like, why is Mercury associated there? Because this determinate spirit was infused with the Logos there. It was established through the Logos because there's a rational order. Thus, Mercury is happy there. Okay, so that's just some textual evidence for the classical view. And again, in summary, the classical view is that the ascendant in the first house is the basis and foundation of the chart. That's what's going to determine the rest of the chart and like how the world is going to unfold for the native. It's going to be associated with the transition from darkness, as we saw in Rhetorius, right? The 12th house, what is the 12th house was there and it passed away. You moved from darkness to light. And when you think of this metaphorically, it's like indeterminacy, right? In the dark, you can't distinguish objects from each other. To light, where you like can distinguish one thing from another. It's a coming to the soul coming to a determinate life. And on this classical view, it's infused with the Logos, it's infused with reason, and hence the place of Mercury's rejoicing, right? And there's this Stoic concept of the Logos spermaticos, or the seed word. And it's the idea that reason permeates everything, like honey is in a honeycomb everywhere. Reason is permeating everything. And because reason is permeating everything, giving things determinate essences, they're going to unfold in a particular way, right? That's why you can trust providence. That's why the Stoic allows fate to unfold and thinks it's ultimately a good thing, because of this belief that the universe is rationally and beautifully ordered. That, for example, an acorn, right, in being what it is infused with the Logos, it is infused with a particular determinate nature that will unfold into an oak tree if the conditions are right for it. Okay. We see this also like picked up in streams of Christianity in John 1:1, where he tells the author of this gospel tells a more mystical version of the story of Christianity. And it begins, en arche, ein ha logos. In the beginning was the word, right? And again, we get both of these concepts. Arche, that first point, right? That first determinate principle. What was there in the beginning? The Logos, reason was there. Reason was there. Reason's with God. Reason was God, right? It's infusing everything. And we can see this connection to Logos and Mercury in the astrological tradition itself, right? We can see they had this philosophical conception of kind of the mechanism for why astrology was a predictive art. So there's this beautiful passage in Menelaus's Astronomica in book 2, lines 65 through 90, where he's absolutely explicit about what he thinks the role of reason is in the practice of astrology, right? So let me read that to you now. He says, "For I shall sing of God, silent-minded monarch of nature, who, permeating sea and sky and land and sea, controls with uniform compact the mighty structure. How the entire universe is alive in the mutual concord of its elements." Right? So it's this idea that astrologers rightly point out that in the classical world, the universe is alive, right? It's got a soul. It's something living. It's something beautiful like that. But notice what Menelaus then goes on to say. It's alive in this mutual concord of elements. Why is it alive? Because it's driven by the pulse of reason, right? It's reason that makes it alive. Reason is what makes it come to life. Reason is something that pulses through the universe. Since a single spirit dwells in all its parts and speeding through all things nourishes the world and shapes it like a living creature, Indeed, unless the whole frame stood fast, composed of kindred limbs and obedient to an overlord, unless providence directed the vast resources of the sky, so again, the idea of providence and fate, the earth would not possess its stability, nor stars their orbits, and the heavens would wander aimlessly or stiffen with inertia. The constellations would not keep their appointed course, nor would alternately the night flee day and put in turn the day to flight. Nor would the rains feed the earth, the winds the upper air, and the sea the laden clouds, rivers, the sea, and the deep springs. The sum of things would not remain for equal through all its parts, so disposed by the fairness of its creator, that neither should the waves of the sea fail, nor the land sink beneath them, nor the revolving heavens become larger and smaller than the mean. So this beautiful universal order, it's set about by the control of a God, and that's executed through reason. Motion sustains and does not alter the edifice. In this due order over the whole universe, do all things abide, following the guidance of a master, providence, through reason. This God and all controlling reason, then, derives earthly beings from the signs of heaven. Though the stars are remote at a far distance, he compels recognition of their influences, in that they give to the peoples of the world their lives and destinies, and to each man his own character. So here we have an explicit account of why astrology could be predictive, right? Why is this art predictive? And he says, well, it's because of providence. And how does providence execute it? It's executed through reason, because the universe is alive. And what that means is that reason is pulsing through it. Okay, so we've got a really clear kind of textual ground in this tradition. And finally, in the classical view, the helm is that place from which life is navigated and the locus of responsibility, right? It's the point where a determinate character is going to be interacting with the world. Okay, so that is the classical position. So now we turn to the contemporary view. What does modern astrology tend to say about the first house? And we have a shift, right? We're now not thinking of the first house in terms of the helm, the site of reason, responsibility, and control, the site that's determining the rest of the world that appears to it. Now we're getting the house of the self, right? And think back to Jessica's lecture earlier on in this series when she talked about the commodification of the body, right? Commodification of the body. We can see this kind of principle at play here when we think of the self, right? So think of like selfies, right? We're not talking about responsibility and control. It's like how do you present yourself to a world? How do you make yourself your own particular brand, right? How do you brand yourself? How do you market yourself? What do you say about yourself by your particular social media feeds or whatever? Right? It's this fundamentally different move. On this view, because they hold to this so-called 12-letter alphabet that mushes together the signs and the houses and the planets, they say that this first place, this first house, is associated with Aries and Mars. So a malefic planet of war and separation, right, as its natural ruler. So the ideas that are going to be in play aren't going to be reason and control and like mediation between heaven and earth. It's going to be more like war of all against all, right? How do you present yourself? How do you keep from being destroyed by other people, right? How do you differentiate yourself in this way in the marketplace? Okay, so then it's commonly referred to as the mask one presents to the world. So it's just, in various like websites and popular astrology books, you can get things like it's associated with surface personality. It's like how you seem to people. It's like your first impressions, like what they immediately think of you. Your likes and dislikes, right? Like something you can put on a social media profile. How you appear, like your fashion and dress, again, like branding, how you like market yourself to the world, and how you project your personality. Right? So these are the cluster of meanings that come from more modern perspective. And we can see it in some of the core texts in the modern period, right? So Stephen Forrest has an important book called The Inner Sky, and he explains why, the kind of rationale for why the first house is conceptualized in this way. And he says, well, each of us is a web of contradictory feelings, right? So notice right from the beginning, right? It's like not each of us is a determinate soul actualizing itself in the world and seeking God. We are fundamentally, well, we're a web of contradictory feelings. It's the feelings that are fundamental to us. It's this emotional layer. We're haunted by memories and premonitions. We're tantalized by dreams. We love, we fear, we create, we know the tragedy of life. To function effectively in the world, we must simplify ourselves. We must translate all the richness of the psyche into a streamlined form. So determinacy is just streamlining, you're pressing it flat, right? You're simplifying yourself. That translation may be a pale reflection of what we really are, but there is no choice. However two-dimensional it seems in comparison with our true self, life requires that we have a personality. A personality is always a role we play, always less than what we truly are. A personality is always a mask. The first house symbolizes our optimal mask, the outer expression that best serves our inner needs. So there's this idea that whatever we fundamentally are, whatever an incarnate soul fundamentally is, it's not going to be the kind of thing that can be rendered determinate in a life, right? Any kind of determinacy is going to falsify it. It's going to flatten that three-dimensional reality. So note that instead of being identified with a determinate life and spirit informed by the logos, the native is now identified with a set of emotions and is thereby rendered essentially indeterminate, right? And in getting the contrast, I was thinking it through earlier that maybe examples of like world historical individuals could be helpful here. So for example, right, when you think of like Julius Caesar or something, right? You think like what he did, this determinate life, something happened and there was an epochal significance to it. And there's the thought that like what that soul was doing was manifest in the external world and it worked in harmony with what the zeitgeist or like the world spirit was doing at that time. This kind of view is lost on the modern view, which would say, well, yeah, but Julius Caesar, like he had a set of emotions that can never be explained. Like you don't understand what he was feeling when he crossed the Rubicon, right? It's something that's essentially indeterminate. So that might be like one illustration or example of like how to think of the difference between these two ways of thinking about the first house. Emotions on this view don't rule out their opposites in the same way that rational properties do. So, for example, right, when we think of emotions, and there's something to this, you can be angry with someone and love them at the same time. Like you can love someone and be angry with them. And a lot of people might think like, aren't those like opposite feelings, right? But yet you can feel it at the same time. You can be sad and happy at the same time, right? Feelings don't seem to rule out their opposites in the same way that you could say like other determinate properties do. Like I could say, because I'm a human, I'm not a prime number, right? And because anything that's a prime number is not a human. These properties, these determinate properties, rule out their opposites. They rule out things that oppose them. But emotions don't do that. They're fluid, right? Because one's core concept of self is essentially incoherent at this, because it's defined of the emotions in this way, this kind of interiority. Any concrete determination of one's life will be, to that extent, falsifying. The first house thus represents that mask that we wear to function in society. So as I was working through these slides, I thought of a side reflection. So just the thought like, does this argument even work, right? Does this justification even work? So I was thinking, yeah, right. Conflicting emotions or so-called conflicting emotions don't rule each other out. You can be happy and sad at the same time. You can be angry and love someone at the same time. But they still do rule out properties, right? So if you want to think of it like, if you are angry, if you are an angry person, you are therefore not an orange, not that fruit. Fruits don't get angry, right? They don't have that kind of like level of consciousness or action, right? They exist in an orangey kind of way. So you can make all these similar kinds of inferences about emotions, right? If you're angry, you're not a prime number, right? If you're angry, you're not an ice cube, right? All of these rational determinations still hold for the emotions, right? So I don't know, just something to think about. Another passage, this one from April Kent. The first house describes your sense of personal identity, your assertiveness, and how you go about getting what you want. The ascendant symbolizes the way you handle the world. It's the welcome mat at your door, the receptionist that limits the world's outside contact with you, and your personal bodyguard. The sign on the ascendant, as well as its ruling planet, tell us a great deal about what we'll experience when we shake your hand, knock on your door, ask you out on a date, pick a fight with you, or interview you for a job. The ascendant may or may not reflect much about who you really are inside. It's essentially a Halloween costume you wear year round. Again, this idea of like the disguise you wear to function in society. Again, we have the idea that determinate modes of being conflict with the deeper self. Rather than considering the incarnate soul as actualized through its determinations, the self is fundamentally at odds with them. Like whatever the determinations are, it's going to be different from what you really are inside. No matter how useful they are to you, they are distinct. You are distinct from your doormat, your receptionist, your bodyguard, right? Just in terms of like the metaphors being used, these are other objects. They are not you. You're using them to present yourself in a certain way. Okay, so that's the modern position. And I want to argue that the most coherent background for this position is developed by Jung, that is coming from the Jungian concept of what he calls the persona. Right. So for Jung, the persona is literally a mask that the ego or consciousness, or kind of like conscious idea of ourselves, that it adopts in order to function in society. So think of it in terms of like professionalization, right? So like professional philosophers will be expected to act in certain ways. They'll be expected to talk in certain ways, walk in certain ways, tell certain jokes, right? You could have a professional philosopher like this. It's a meme that was popular a while ago called scumbag analytic philosophers that are pretty funny. So there's like sets of dispositions and behaviors and actions that are expected in a profession, and you're supposed to act a particular way. And if you don't, you're rejected, right? It's something you violated a taboo somehow. So that's one way we can see an example of like a persona that we're expected to follow. I think more importantly, or more clearly, is we can see in family systems theory, the roles of children in dysfunctional families, right? So in family systems theory, they talk about there can be a dysfunctional family. There can like be parents with problems individually and then having problems together in their relationship. And then as a family, they offload this dysfunction onto the kids, and the kids are supposed to pick up particular roles in order for the family to keep functioning, right? And these roles aren't tracking with what the kids actually are, right? With their actually desires and needs as human beings. So some kids might be hero kids, right? They're going to be the ones with good grades or great at sports, right? And they're expected to win all the time so that the family can feel good about itself and they can ignore their problems. Or the lost child might be expected to have no needs and just like chill out by his or herself all the time and not make any demands on anyone, so that like they don't upset the apple cart and don't cause further problems in the family. Or the scapegoat can be expected to be the bad one and the rebel and the one that's like gets into problems and like does drugs or breaks the rules and somehow gets in trouble with the law maybe, so that the family can be like, no dysfunction here, it's that kid, right? It can be like literally a scapegoat. And all of these are roles, they're general roles that don't track what the kids actually are, right? So the Jungian analysis has some force in these kinds of contexts. So then he explains it. This arbitrary segment of the collective psyche, often fashioned with considerable pains, I have called the persona. The term persona is really a very appropriate expression for this. For originally, it means the mask once worn by actors to indicate the role they played. It is, as its name implies, only a mask that feigns individuality, making others and oneself believe that one is individual, whereas one is simply acting a role through which the collective psyche speaks. And again, the example from family systems theory is really clear here, right? Like all these people like think, the hero kids, they think they're like being real individual. Like I'm a straight A valedictorian student, right? I'm something that's very individual about me. But then if you look back and look at other families with similar structures, you notice that all these hero kids are playing the same role, or all these lost children, or all these scapegoats, right? You think it's something very individual, but really it's just something collective, this collective kind of role that's being played out. When we analyze the persona, we strip off the mask and discover that what seemed to be individual is at bottom collective. In other words, that the persona was only a mask of the collective. Fundamentally, the persona is nothing real. It is a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. The persona is a semblance, a two-dimensional reality. And see, we could see like what was coming from the astrological literature, right? It's a flattening, two-dimensional, just a mask, right? So I think this is the kind of conceptual background for why they're using this language in modern astrology. Okay, so that is the distinction itself. Hopefully you can see by now that these are really different and conflicting concepts being used and employed. So now I want to go on to argue, took the time. Now I want to go on to argue that this distinction is grounded in a distinction of worldviews. Some fundamental shifts happened in worldview that can account for why these astrological doctrines differ, why they see the first house in different ways. And the first has to do with the nature of society. There's a social grounds for this distinction, and it turns on what's called the death of God. Right? So in classical social reality, the universe is essentially meaningful, as we saw with that passage from Menelaus, right? Reason is up in heaven, reason is with the gods, and that permeates down to the physical world. The physical world is informed, the natural world has an order, right? There's an intelligible spiritual world beyond us that informs, infuses, and guides the natural world. The principle as above, so below. There's a higher spiritual reality that we're seeking to mirror in society, that we were using that as the norms by which to judge ourselves and how we treat each other as in a civilization. And then each person's social life is lived within this whole, both above, right, the spiritual world, and also as that like manifests itself out in the world of nature. Nature is itself something fundamentally meaningful, right? And we live within that. Society occurs within this order. Because of this view, religion ended up being essential to society, or like religious practice and ritual was essential to kind of how society structured itself. So we have explicit cases like, you know, when Caesars would call themselves gods, or same with certain pharaohs. But we can also see kind of lesser cases like with Moses or Solomon, right? Moses, the great lawgiver. Why is Moses a good leader? Because God called Moses and God delivered 10 commandments to Moses and gave Moses the law. Same with Solomon. So why is Solomon a good king? Because he chose to be wise and God gave Solomon wisdom. Right? Solon, he's a Greek lawgiver, and it's said that he went and traveled to Egypt to learn from the priests, and that what's helped inform his just laws. Numa, who's an early Roman king who said that religious ritual was very important to the life of Rome. And then in European history, the character of Jesus, the idea that there's this sage teacher that's telling us about reality, and that ends up informing a particular like church that plays a role in society in Europe. So on this view, one's social life had an inherently spiritual dimension. One could walk a spiritual path while playing one's part in society. Right? So the spiritual world and the natural world went hand in hand. You're doing your social stuff, but the spiritual world infuses it. All those social determinations, they're ways that you could express your spiritual identity, right? And that's not only for world historical figures. It's not just like for a pharaoh or for a Caesar, but also just simple actions, right? There's a meditative book by Brother Lawrence who talks about like, I can practice the presence of God when picking up a straw, right? I can pick up a straw, and I'm still being united with the absolute, right? I can turn a cake, and that still has spiritual significance to it. So a quote here by a philosopher, Julius Evola, about traditional civilization and this kind of idea of a spiritual orientation for it. And he claims, every traditional civilization is characterized by the presence of beings who, by virtue of their innate or acquired superiority over the human condition, embody within the temporal order the living and efficacious presence of a power that comes from above. One of these types of beings is the pontifex, according to the inner meaning of the word and according to the original value of the function that he exercised. Pontifex means builder of bridges or paths. Pons in ancient times also meant paths, connecting the natural and supernatural dimensions. Moreover, the pontifex was traditionally identified with the king, right? So when we think of like kings in ancient society, it wasn't just that they were conceptualizing themselves as like, I want to be, you know, the big person on top, right? But like it was viewed as like the authority of the social structure is at least striving theoretically for the higher world, right? For what we want is for our world to like be tethered to the divine, to have this bridge to the spiritual dimension. Servius, a 4th century commentator on Virgil's works, reports the custom of our ancestors was that the king should also be pontifex and priest. A saying of the Nordic tradition reads, "May our leader be our bridge." Thus, real monarchs were the steadfast personification of the life beyond ordinary life. Beneficial spiritual influences used to radiate upon the world from mortal beings and from the mere presence of such men. From their pontifical mediation, from the power of the rites that were rendered efficacious by their power, and from the institutions of which they were the center, right? So again, this religious component for it, that's the religious rites that these people who are connected to the divine institute, they infuse society with a kind of spiritual meaning. These influences permeated people's thoughts, intentions, and actions, order every aspect of their lives, and constituting a fit foundation for luminous spiritual realizations, right? The thought that like, yeah, you can be spiritually, like live in the world and like spiritually live a physical life in a society, right? Because these kinds of structures are there that are aiming for that higher world. These influences also made propitious the general conditions for prosperity, health, and good fortune. That was the classical view, right? And then something changed. Something changed in Europe, and it was called the death of God. There are various philosophical reasons for it, but basically, like at an intellectual and high cultural level, people stopped believing in religion, or they stopped associating themselves with like the power of religious rites. They thought of reality in a fundamentally different way. But it took a long time for people to notice the social significance of these kind of philosophical moves that happened. And Nietzsche was one who like pointed it out. He saw ahead of time what these kinds of implications would be of the kind of worldview shift that happened in his day. And he uses the example of the death of God, which talks about a madman who walks into the marketplace. He claims, "Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, 'I seek God, I seek God.' As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter." "Has he got lost?" asked one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" asked another. "Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Has he immigrated?" Thus they yelled and laughed. So you have these people who are like thinking like very highly of themselves. Someone is asking about God and they think it's just, you know, it's childish. Haven't you woken up? Don't you understand? Are you some kind of foreigner or something? You don't understand our high civilization? But then the madman responds. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him. You and I. All of us are his murderers. How did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon?" Right? Think the horizon, the ascendant. It's gone now. We've wiped it out. "What were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun?" Those kind of like orientations that Manilius was talking about, that the Logos provided. "Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not light continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. So he's talking about like this fundamental shift that happens, and we're now fundamentally not oriented anymore. We don't have an orientation for society anymore, claims this madman. And this shift has happened, and now we're just waiting for the God to decompose. We're waiting for these structures to decompose. It's just rotting because of this fundamental change that's happened. And it has been further related that on the same day, the madman forced his way into several churches, and there struck up his Requiem Aeterno Deo. So that's just like a dirge for God. Let out and called to account, he is said to have replied nothing but, what after all are all these churches now, if they are not tombs and sepulchres of God? Right. So there might be magnificent cathedrals, people might be in churches, but it's disconnected from society now. They're just tombs. They're just mourning. They're just like remembering God, but it's not having the spiritual dimension, isn't having that active orienting power anymore. Okay, so then what happened? Well, with the elimination of the transcendent dimension, the horizon was lost. Menelius talked about the horizon. There's another beautiful passage in the Astronomica where he says that the horizon and the other cardinal points, the midheaven and the imum coli, these are like fixed points that anchor the zodiac. And if these anchors weren't there, the zodiac would go flying off into space, right? And you can think that like with the death of God, something like that has happened. We've lost that horizon, or society has lost that horizon and doesn't have that orienting point anymore, the spiritual orientation. Durkheim, who's a sociologist, who wrote a famous book on suicide, where he analyzed it from a sociological perspective, just looking at like social trends and so forth. And he noted that spikes in suicide correlated with a phenomenon of what he called anomie, which is just the breakdown of values, the feeling like nothing matters anymore. The things that you oriented your life towards, the meanings you had, fell apart and don't make sense anymore. And Durkheim argued like this is a key predictor of suicide, right? It's so disastrous for the human. Or again, from a different angle, the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who was an existentialist kind of therapist, he lived through the concentration camps. Like he went through this horror, right? And he noted that the people that could survive, right, the ones that could make it through this intense suffering, they're the ones that clung to a meaning. They had meaning in their lives. Whereas the ones who succumb to it, the ones that like weren't able to survive the horror, oftentimes they didn't believe they had any meaning anymore. The suffering didn't make any sense, right? There was no kind of structure to hold it. So Frankl cites another passage from Nietzsche where he says, the one who has a why can bear almost any how, right? The suffering we can take as human beings, but we need to have a reason for it. And when that reason is lost, when anomie happens, when the horizon is washed away, right, then it's really distressful for us. It's hard to like keep on living. Right? It's the argument of Durkheim. So, since society can no longer aspire to mirror the spiritual realm or to ground itself in a natural order, it is seen as organized only by power relations. Thus, you're going to see religion as an opiate of the masses, right? When you think of religion, it's not going to be about like the transcendent ideals it was aiming for. It's going to be instead like, look at that jerk. He just like told these stories in order to amass power for himself, right? In order to oppress certain people, to have power, right? Or again, with basically any other ideal, goodness, truth, beauty, all these things, they're seen as ideological constructs in order to bolster, kind of like get to the top of the heap socially, to keep power over others, right? To climb to the top of that dominance hierarchy. These are weapons of war. They're not actually like ways of grasping God or reality. So as a result, we can think of a fundamental dismembering of Mercury that happened, right? In this context, Mercury's meanings are broken apart. For the classical tradition and even into Enlightenment philosophy and German idealism, there was an association of like two different concepts of reason, right? There was Verstand in German, which is understanding, which is what happens when like you're given a particular thing and you like subsume it under concepts, right? I could like take a thermos and be like, spatiotemporal thing given to me, and I'm like subsuming it under the concept of thermos now. And Verstand would be happy. I've understood it, right? And if we're curious, we can dig further and like look at it like, okay, but what's it made of, right? What's its atomic structure? We can keep on doing this and like understanding this way, understanding the particulars, subsuming them under universals. But there was another concept of reason as well, and that was Vernunft, reason as such. And this, claimed Kant, was the faculty that strove to grasp the unconditioned, right? It's the faculty that's always asking why, right? When the little kid is saying like, why is this? Why is that? And you give an answer and they're like, oh, why is that, right? That's what reason's doing. Reason is giving this wonder that starts philosophy, right? It's this wanting to know why, and it's not going to be satisfied until it reaches the unconditioned, till it grasps the totality, till it gets the final answer or the final vision, right? So this was associated with Mercury as well, right? Reason and intellect, it has this kind of function of grasping the whole. It has this function of wonder, of wanting the unconditioned. The intellect in this post-death of God society is now no longer a faculty through which we can apprehend the eternal, but we see it as a tool to dissect the natural world, right? Foucault's got this quote like, knowledge is for cutting, right? And we can think it like, you think of a scientist, they're like going to find an animal and like want to learn about it. What are they going to do? They're going to dissect it, right? You're going to cut it apart. And then we start getting these ideas like associated with like, well, and that's what intellect is. That's like all it does. It like cuts stuff up, it kills it. And then that gets associated with Mercury. Mercury is now no longer the rational mediator between worlds, the patron of philosophy and astrology, but is associated exclusively with the small, with analysis, with cutting those things up, and most bewilderingly with deconstruction. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, but like most people use deconstruction in a way that's like antithetical to the meaning it's like philosophically developed in. The intellect is now conceived as something essentially opposed to spirituality, right? You think that like, yeah, Mercury, it like does his stuff, it does its stuff, it's like analyzing things, but like you can't walk a spiritual path that way. We need the higher octaves, right? We need Uranus, we need like the French Revolution, or like we need Neuralink, and we need, just like have a social media feed in your head all the time, like much better. Like we're gonna have enlightenment that way. We need these higher octaves, these transpersonal planets. And in this way, you have this fundamental like severing of meaning in Mercury, and then like its association like only with this one half, and not seeing that other bigger searching for the unconditioned concept of reason and philosophy. Okay. So time. Novalis is a romantic philosopher who gives an analysis of this situation that's really beautiful, but I'm going to skip it for the purposes of time. What are the consequences for astrology? In a world stripped of transcendence, the modern identification of the first house with the persona makes sense, right? You're living in a post-death of God world, and in a social world that's like operating by those principles, it makes absolute sense why you'd think of the first house as the persona in Jung's kind of sense, and this kind of thing that's essentially flattening, right? That's essentially like, if you want to like use that example to like abusive families and the roles children play, like something that's essentially abusive, right? It's something that's like fundamentally at odds with who you really are. It's this mask you have to wear. Why? Well, in this kind of social world, how's the soul going to actualize its true nature in the world if the world is merely unthinking matter bereft of all value, right? If all value is something that's just like, it's just going to be like stuff that's like going to be used to like circulate capital and like give people more power, or like to investigate stuff to like, make more weapons, like the soul's not going to be happy with that. Like you're not going to find any spiritual calling there or spiritual meaning there. All of the soul's determinations would have to be merely physical and thus fail to express what the soul essentially is, namely spiritual being, right? So yeah, if like the social world is construed in this way as just like raw power relations, then yeah, like it's just going to be a mask. You have to like operate to survive. Your spiritual being is not going to be able to be expressed. So after the world was disenchanted, the bridges burned and the bridge builders forgotten, the worldly actualization of the soul became unthinkable, right? You can't think of like picking up a straw and that being of value, right? That having spiritual value. Religion, deriving from the Latin word religare, means to bind back. But if the spiritual worlds, or the spiritual and natural worlds, are essentially unbridgeable, as they are believed to be in modernity, then religion becomes impossible. You can't bind it back if there's nothing there, right? There's no more horizon anymore because there's nothing above it. In such a world, if the soul is to find sustenance, it cannot look to the wasteland outside it, but must rather turn within. One must be spiritual, not religious, right? It's this idea that like, outside stuff, it's just like cutting, it's just power relations, it's just like physical stuff, and spirit's not going to be happy there. There's nothing out there for me, right? And reason and intellect, that's all just about like cutting up the external stuff. Like there's nothing for me there. I have to be spiritual, not religious. I have to turn inside. I need these transpersonal planets to help me in my spiritual quest, right? I need Neptune to dissolve all the distinctions, and then I can have like indeterminate harmony with everything. Is the idea. And you could see it makes sense in the social context, right? Okay, now for the even bigger distinction, I think even more fundamentally and more importantly, these kinds of different conceptions of the absolute, different conceptions of the ascendant are grounded in different conceptions of the absolute. They're grounded in different metaphysical systems about what ultimate reality is. On the classical view, we can get something like a Platonic worldview. Right? I'm going to use this for an example just because of the basics of it kind of like held up through various iterations of philosophy. So on this basic worldview in the classical picture, the unseen world is more real than the seen. Right? So that sounds weird to us, but just to like get us thinking in that direction, like think about numbers and mathematics, right? You don't see them. You might say like, oh, two is like 2 sticks, right? And then I put 2 sticks and 2 sticks, and I've got 4 sticks there. But that's not really true because you could burn the sticks and start a fire, right? But the fact that 2 + 2 is 4 still holds, right? Or I might draw a really like garbage triangle in the dust, right? And you might see it and you'll see it's like defective, but you can like see it as a triangle and you like recognize it. And Plato and like the Platonist would say something like, and you recognize it because like you already knew you had this ideal triangle like in your mind apprehended it before, this perfect thing you haven't seen with your eyes, right? And it's invisible, and it's the standards by which we can evaluate the empirical world. And as a result, the visible world is a mere shadow of the invisible, right? There's this fundamental reality that's not seen that grounds the seen. We can talk about more arguments for this in Q&A if you want. On this view, forms, which constitute the intelligible essences of things, reside in the invisible world. Things are what they are by participating in their corresponding forms, right? So I might have a quartz crystal, right? It is what it is, claimed Plato, by participating in a particular form. It participates in the form of quartz crystal, right? And it's the kind of thing that's going to unite all different kinds of quartz crystals. You might have some in your room, right? And these all are quartz crystals, but not every one of them is identical with that concept of it, right? They participate in it, participate in that form. But if I were to magically like somehow destroy this one, that form would still be there and set the standards for what it is, right? It sets the intelligible essences of things. A tree is a tree by participating in the form treeness. Mm-hmm. Moreover, these forms are essentially determinate. If they're going to play this kind of role of setting determinate entities, like setting up the essences of things, well, then it's got to be what it is and not its opposite, right? So if a linden tree is a linden tree by participating in the form of linden tree, right? It's not going to be a German Shepherd, right? It's going to have to rule out the form of being a German Shepherd, right? These are different things, and being a linden tree is going to entail certain things and rule out other things. And in these entailments, it's going to generate certain kinds of rational hierarchies, right? So a linden tree is going to participate in the form of linden tree, but in doing so, it's also going to have to participate in the form of tree, right? It's going to have to participate in the form of plant. Right? So it's going to generate these kinds of rational harmonies, rational hierarchies. You'll get some things that like fall under certain forms or concepts, and also other concepts that are ruled out from them, right? It generates this kind of determinate structure. This framework is entailed by some of Plato's most famous illustrations and arguments. So we can take from the dialogues his divided line and the diatomist ladder. I'll walk you through each of those. So the divided line occurs in the Republic, where he's starting to set forth his idea of the forms and starting to tell his friends about it. Right? And it's a really helpful illustration to understand kind of the core of what he's talking about. He says, basically, like, just draw a line, real simple illustration, draw a line. And he says, understand then that, as we said, there are these two things, one sovereign of the intelligible kind in place and the other of the visible. It is like a line divided into two unequal sections, right? So the intelligible is the invisible. So you're going to take a line and cut it in two sections. One's going to represent the invisible world of the forms. The other is going to be the visible stuff we can see. And then divide each section, namely that of the visible and that of the intelligible, in the same ratio as the line. So we're going to cut each of those into sections by the same ratio. Now, in terms of relative clarity and opacity, one subsection of the visible consists of images. And by images, I mean first shadows, then reflections of water, and in all close-packed, smooth and shiny materials, and everything of that sort. So at the very bottom, we've cut the visible, and at the very lowest rung of the visible, we're going to have stuff like shadows, right? I might like wave my hand and it's going to cast a shadow across the wall. I might like get a shiny object, like the thermos, right? And you might see a reflection in it. These have a certain kind of reality, like shadows are, right? But they're not fundamental reality. You can explain the being of the shadow by like talking about my hand and the light source in the background, right? You can explain all its movements by this more fundamental reality of the physical object. The same with reflections in waters and with close packed and shiny materials, right? So at the lowest section of the visible are just these like reflections and images, right? Just this ephemeral kinds of changing things. In the other subsection of the visible, we're going to move up a level, put the originals of these things, namely animals around us and all the plants and the whole class of manufactured things, right? So yeah, that's just the natural world, right? The natural world that's like casting the shadows. That's the other visible stuff. Right? Okay. This part gets a little tricky. As regards to truth and untruth, the division in this is in this proportion. As the opinable is to knowledge, so the likeness is to the thing that it is like. So here he's saying that analogy between shadow and object is going to hold between what he calls the realm of opinion, which is that visible world, and the realm of knowledge, which is the realm of the forms. So it's another way of saying that like all of the physical stuff as well is operating like a shadow, right? It's itself cast by a more fundamental level of reality that we cannot see. And that's known though. Understand now how the section of the intelligible is to be divided. In one subsection, the soul, using as images the things that were imitated before, is forced to investigate from hypotheses, proceeding not to a first principle, but to a conclusion. In the other subsection, however, it makes its way to a first principle that is not a hypothesis, proceeding from a hypothesis, but without the images used in the previous subsection, using forms themselves and making its investigation through them. So as we ascend up, and now we're in the realm of the invisible, like the lower half of that invisible realm is going to be something that like you get at through hypotheses. You're still kind of having to do like visually kind of stuff to understand. So like things like geometry or again, like mathematics, right? You might have to write an equation to understand it, or you might have to draw a diagram in order to grasp the thing. But the thing itself is invisible, right? But you're having to use a hypothesis to get there. In the higher part, once you ascend from that, the images are dropped completely, right? The visible stuff is dropped completely and you get pure forms. You've got a vision of the pure forms. He claims, by the other subsection of the intelligible, this higher realm, I mean that by which reason itself grasps the power of the dialectic, right? So this higher power of reason, at the very top, reason is operating. It does not consider these hypotheses as first principles, but truly as hypotheses, but as stepping stones to take off from, enabling it to reach that unhypothetical first principle of everything. Having grasped this principle, it reverses itself, and keeping hold of what follows from it, comes down to a conclusion without making use of anything visible at all, but only of forms themselves, moving on from forms to forms and ending in forms. So the idea here is that like once reason is like operating in the sphere and can grasp this unhypothetical first principle, you see how everything else follows from it. Right? You can think of like a mystical vision, right? Or at the end of Dante's Paradiso, when he talks about, he finally sees this beatific vision of God, and he says, in there, I saw how substance, mode, and accident were all intertwined, and all the leaves of nature were standing there in harmony, right? Like these leaves of the book, all in this one vision. Right? And this is what Plato is talking about. You get the first principle, it's by reason, but you grasp it and you grasp everything else from it in this pure vision at the very top. So when we work it through and like draw it out, we get something like this. On the right-hand side of the diagram is the metaphysical structure. And on the left-hand side is what's called the epistemic structure, or like the structure of like knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that correspond to the various levels of reality. At the very top is the form of the good, this ultimate form, this unhypothetical first principle from which everything else emanates. And then there are lesser emanations of that, this entire hierarchy of the forms, this infinite hierarchy of the invisible forms. Under that are the mathematical and geometrical objects that have some kind of like image relation to it, some kind of like visibly kind of stuff attached to it. Below that, regular physical objects we're acquainted with. And below that is shadows and reflections. And then the corresponding modes of cognition that go with it, noesis, at the top, understanding. Again, this is something like this spiritual vision is something that's attained by the understanding and attained by reason on the classical view, on the Platonic view. Below that is thought, a dianoia, like thinking through. It's like this kind of like more discursive kind of reasoning. Below that is belief or pistis. That's where physical objects are. So it's interesting for Plato, right? Any knowledge of the physical world, any kind of like empirical knowledge that a lot of people want to say is like, that's most certain. That's the most, that's the stuff we can see. That Plato would be like, yeah, it kind of, but it's like faith, right? This is the realm of faith. It's not certain. The certainty is that invisible realm. And at the very lowest level is imaging, ikasia, and that corresponds to the shadows and reflections, right? So it's this really clear, helpful picture to understand this basic Platonic model. And it's interesting to note that in a lot of the astrological literature, you'll get things like, oh yeah, Plato talks about images, right? And shadows and reflections. Like, well, it's like, yeah, but that's the lowest level, right? And then like usually those texts like go on to be like, oh yeah, and like ultimate, the form of the good is like this structured in this way. It's like, no. Form of the good is like, it's grasped in a different kind of way than that. The images and reflections are at the lowest level, still emanations from the form of the good, still good in a certain kind of way, but not the way reality is ultimately structured. Okay. Good. The next illustration of Plato's position will tell us kind of more about how the forms themselves are structured. Like when we're talking about particular forms, what are they like? And this occurs in Plato's Symposium, which contains a variety of speeches on love, on the nature of love. And it's a really fun read if you haven't looked at it yet. In Socrates' speech in this work, he recounts a theory of love. He was taught by the priestess Diotima. So again, this religious kind of picture that he's articulating here. According to this teaching, love, when properly used, allows us to ascend from the visible world to the invisible. The idea of a ladder, right? And again, like think of our Hillman quote at the beginning, like all these philosophers, it was always the soul's descent. It always goes downward, right? There's also the ladder, right? There's also an ascent. There's also a moving up, right? So yeah, just something to think about. Okay, bottom rung of the ladder. How do we proceed if we're going to like move by this way of love up to the contemplation of the form, the beautiful, or the good itself? He says, well, it begins naturally by falling in love with a particular body, right? Like your hormones take control. You're like, see someone like they're beautiful. You're like, this beautiful body, right? It's an instinct, right? It's this one particular person, like as a beautiful object. It's this beautiful material thing in front of one. And like they start. That's the beginning of the journey. And then he says, like, yeah, but then like the the excitement wears off and you come to realize that like, yeah, in general, like if you're talking about just like the bodily level, like aren't there other beautiful bodies, and shouldn't you be committed to like all beautiful bodies? Shouldn't you love all beautiful bodies equally, right? And then from there he says like, yeah, and then after that, after you're in that phase, like you realize that like, no, about that person you loved, what was really important? Was it how they looked? Was it their body, or was it their soul? And he says like you come to realize that like what's like really beautiful about people is their souls. It's their character. It's how they act. Were they kind and loving and caring, right? Or were they like jerks? So that's the important thing about people, or it's really their souls. And you come to see the beauty of souls, and you come to prioritize that. You move to this different level. And then he notes, like, yeah, and then once you're at that stage, you're loving all these beautiful souls, you start thinking like, okay, what makes people kind and good and compassionate, right? What makes it in general that people come to have characters that are shaped in this way? And he says, like, well, one thing that helps is beautiful laws and customs, right? If a culture values these things, values compassion, values wisdom, it's going to have certain kind of institutional norms and customs in place that teach that, right? So on this hierarchy, like these laws and customs are like ultimately responsible for like the shape of character and people's characters and like the way their souls like actualize themselves. So this is a higher level of beauty. You come to love that. It's more responsible for it. Then you ascend higher. You come to see, okay, one comes to love beauty and wisdom and knowledge. Like why was it that some customs and rituals and social institutions and norms were good while others were bad, right? What differentiated those two? Well, the ones that were actually like wise did the good ones, right? The ones that actually like knew how human nature functioned and what it should do, and knew the spiritual world, right? Those are the ones that were good. So then higher than social custom and beautiful laws is going to be wisdom and knowledge, understanding how reality is actually structured. Right? That's even higher. You're going to come to love this. You're going to love these intellectual laws, these forms, this wisdom. Then he says, if everything goes right, you might make the ascent, the final ascent, and see the form of beauty itself. Right? You might behold this mystical vision. And Diotima explains it here. So Socrates is reporting what Diotima taught him at this point. The man who has been thus far guided in matters of love, who has beheld beautiful things in the right order and correctly, is coming now to the goal of loving. All of a sudden, he will catch sight of something wonderfully beautiful in its nature. That, Socrates, is the reason for all his earlier labors. First, it always is, and neither comes to be nor passes away, neither waxes nor wanes. Second, it is not beautiful in this way and ugly in that way, nor beautiful at one time and ugly at another, nor beautiful in relation to one thing and ugly in relation to another. Nor is it beautiful here, but ugly there, as it would be if it were beautiful for some people and ugly for others. Nor will the beautiful appear to him in the guise of a face or hands or anything else that belongs to the body. It's this purely spiritual thing. It will not appear to him as one idea or one kind of knowledge. It is not anywhere in another thing, as it is in an animal or an earth or in heaven or in anything else, but itself by itself with itself. It's absolute beauty, absolutely determinate beauty in itself. It is always one in form, and all the beautiful things that share in that in such a way that when those others come to be and pass away, this does not become the least bit smaller or greater or suffer any change. So it's this vision of this absolute beauty that always is. It doesn't come to be or pass away. It doesn't change in any way at all, but yet it's responsible. This absolute beauty is responsible for all those materially beautiful things. It's the ground of them, right? Being absolutely beautiful, but it's not itself a physical object. So from this, we can see that Plato's conception of the forms, right, taking the form of beauty as an example, the form of beauty eternally is, right? It's in the realm of the unchanging. It's eternal. It's in the realm of being, not becoming. So it doesn't change. It doesn't come into being and pass away. It's not this kind of fluctuating kind of thing. And the form of beauty is itself absolutely beautiful, right? It's going to be like total beauty. It's going to be like it in its purest form, right? Ultimate beauty. And because of that, because it's determinate, it's going to conflict with all that's not beautiful, right? It's going to rule out ugliness. It's going to rule out deformity. It's going to rule out hideousness, right? They are incompatible with this form because it's pure beauty. So it's determinate, right? It's this determinate form, eternal determinate form. Good. See on time. I'm going to skip this next section where I argue that this model was continued well into the medieval period, and we can talk about that in Q&A if you want, but I want to make sure that we end on time. So I'm going to skip this section here. But it's this interesting argument about what's called the ontological argument. And basically it ends up like these kind of Christian theologians end up like appropriating, like using Plato's form of the good and holding to the same kind of structure in their theology. But I want to make sure we have time to get to the modern absolute. Okay. So if we contrast this classical picture with the modern view, the classical view said absolute reality is essentially one, rational and determinate, right? Think of that form of beauty. Because supremely good, the absolute cannot be evil, right? So if you're going to say like the form of the good is good, it's not going to be evil, right? It's going to rule that out. And if the absolute is wise, if it's a form of wisdom, it's not going to be ignorant. It's going to rule that out. It's rational and determinate. If it's powerful, it's not going to be weak. Right? It's going to rule that out. This is the classical kind of conception here. Yet, it is just such a divided, irrational, and indeterminate account of the divine nature or the absolute that modern spiritualism preaches. You end up with claims that like, oh yeah, this absolute is like always changing and fluctuating and like it holds all these opposites together like undifferentiatedly. And I think that the clearest account of this, kind of like the most philosophically grounded of these kind of like modern spiritualist writers is Jung. He's clearer, he's a little more familiar with the philosophical tradition, and we can gain insight into the modern position by looking at his work. So for Jung, his concept of the absolute is informed by his idea of the collective unconscious, right? So this is operating from within the Freudian revolution in psychology, right? And the Freudian revolution was fundamental. It's a fundamental change in orientation from the kind of classical philosophical conception where you think like, dude, you're a rational agent. You're a rational agent, and like you've got a character, and you've got like intentions and goals and things you're striving for, and like you do that and you think about it, and like you've got a life path and you can be responsible for that. The Freudian revolution has this idea of like the iceberg, right? So I've got a little iceberg picture in the corner here. It says like, well, yeah, you've got all that like consciousy kind of stuff, you got all that like rationally stuff going on up top, right? That's not the real reality of you. The real reality is this unconscious, right? That what's below the surface, all of these hidden things. And for Freud, he wanted to say that, yeah, what's below the surface is these impulses, right? There are these various impulses that you think are no good, right? It's your animal impulses, your childish impulses, these things that you've been habituated to think are bad or shameful. You've hidden them from yourself. You've repressed them, but they're actually what's calling the shots. Right? Underneath the ego personality is the S or the it or the id, right? It's just these raw desires. And that's what's actually calling the shots, right? So for another illustration, like think of an old train, right? Where they're going and they're like going along the tracks and there's smoke coming out of the top, right? There is smoke coming out of the top of that train. You can think of that as like your rational ego consciousness there. But what's really pulling the thing along? What's the actual mechanism, right? Well, it's the engine on the train. It's like how it interacts with the tracks. It's that physical thing right there. And for Freud, that's going to be the unconscious, right? It's the id, right? That's calling. It's really doing all the work of your life, right? And this power, this kind of like this constellation of drives, they're going to be for Freud something that's personal to you, right? It's experiences you've had usually in childhood that you've learned were bad, right? For Freud, he's going to say like almost everything is just a articulation of the Oedipal complex. It's really because you wanted to kill your father and marry your mother, right? Everything was about this, right? It's these bad taboo drives that you have. You've repressed them, and that's like what's revealing itself as neurosis, and then the rest of your life, like why you're doing what you're doing. Jung moves from this position, right? He takes this basic orienting point of the unconscious. He adapts it and says like, yeah, the Freudian revolution is basically right. He just disagrees in two key aspects, right? So the first is that he says, you're wrong to try to articulate the libido, this thing, this power beneath the surface purely with sexuality, right? It's not just sexual stuff. It's something else. It's like some other kind of energy, right? So there's an expansion from the Freudian view. And he says that the unconscious isn't just personal experiences. It's not just stuff you experienced as a child yourself and came to repress, but there's also this other collective layer, something that everyone shares as humanity, that structures our actions, that's equally unconscious, right? So hence it's collective. It appears in various cultures and manifestations. And he articulates the structure of the collective unconscious by the archetypes. And the archetypes he defines as the a priori and formal conditions of apperception. So all of this could be Kantian and philosophical, right? At this point, a priori, something prior to experience, formal, having to do with like the pre-shaping of experiences, like the formal character of it. Conditions of apperception, like how the ego, how consciousness like sees itself, how it perceives itself, how the eye is aware of itself. All of that's like traditional like philosophical territory. And he says that are based on instincts, right? There's the fundamental move. There's the Freudian orientation, right? Yeah, all of this is really coming from the unconscious and it's coming from instincts, right? It's just more articulate instincts than you thought, right? It's not just your story. It's like this general instinctual story that developed because life evolved in a certain kind of way. So because of this basic orientation, Jung claims the collective unconscious is irrational, right? Though it directs conscious personality like a figure on a chessboard by an invisible player, it also has no deliberate and concerted plan, no general teleological plan. So that teleological plan is that kind of telos that Manilius was talking about, right? This should make astrologers worried, thinking like, what? There's no teleological plan here? No general teleological plan, and does not strive to realize certain definite ends. Right? It's not acting for anything. It's not a conscious kind of striving. It's not a rational kind of striving. Rather, it only operates as an indistinct urge towards self-realization. Right? It's this indistinct urge. This is how the collective unconscious functions. Right? It's calling the shots. You're getting pushed around like a player on a chessboard, but it's not pushing it according to a general determinate plan. Right? It's not a mind that's pushing it. It's something else. It's this instincty kind of urge. Okay. Archetypes are also essentially metaphorical and essentially indeterminate. So because they are this instincty kind of things, right, they're not going to have a determinate structure, because then it's going to like lend itself to a kind of like teleological explanation, a rational explanation, and acting towards ends. So an archetypal content expresses itself first and foremost in metaphors. If such a content should speak of the sun and identify it with the lion, the king, the hoard of gold guarded by the dragon, or the power that makes for the life and health of man, it is neither the one thing nor the other, but the unknown third thing that finds more or less adequate expression in all these similes. Yet, to the perpetual vexation of the intellect, again, this claim that like intellect can't grasp it. This thing, it's always frustrating the intellect. It remains unknown and not to be fitted into a formula. Right? And the reason it's unknown is because intellect only grasps formulas, right? It's only Verstand and not Vernunft. It's only this kind of cutting up kind of intellect. So this thing will have no kind of intellectual structure to it. It's going to be metaphorical and essentially indeterminate. Jung then associates the collective unconscious with what he calls the self, or the totality in which the ego is surrounded. Right? This ends up being the goal of Jungian individuation. And it's marked by what he calls a conjunction of opposites. So in his later writings, he started talking about alchemy and this conjunction of opposites. And he claims the factors which come together in the conjunctio are conceived as opposites, either confronting one another in enmity or attracting one another in love. Right? So your ego's there, you're trying to like reconcile yourself with the collective unconscious as a whole, this totality. And these contents, these archetypes, they themselves have these kind of like, they're shape-shifting, they're always changing, and they also contradict each other. Right? It's this massive, like nebulous, incoherent whole that you're trying to reconcile yourself with. So he uses example like, it's moist and dry, it's cold and warm, it's upper and lower, it's spirit, soul, and body, it's heaven and earth, it's fire and water, it's bright and dark, it's active and passive, it's gaseous and fixed, it's precious and common, it's good and evil. That one's really important. Good and evil, open and hidden, masculine and feminine, sun and moon. Right, so we've got this like mess of indeterminate contents that are conflicting with each other, right? And the self comes to be by a unification of these things somehow. Right? You're reconciling yourself with these things somehow. These pairs of opposites do not belong to the ego personality, but are supraordinate to it. The ego personality occupies an intermediate position. The pairs of opposites constitute the phenomenology of the paradoxical self. Right, so the self is bigger than the ego, and it's going to have these opposing, conflicting properties all together in an undifferentiated manner. Man's totality. That is why their symbolism makes use of cosmic expressions like heaven and earth. The intensity of the conflict is expressed in symbols like fire and water and height and depth and life and death. Okay, so I made a little picture up at the top. Like you've got this broad total self that's got all these like contradictory properties, and the ego is trying to like reconcile itself with all of those, right? And if you want to think about like how the collective unconscious like structures both like physical stuff and like mentally kind of stuff, he calls it the unus mundus, this conjunction of opposites. Okay, so Jung explicitly says like we can't grasp this thing, this self towards which we're striving. It transcends our powers of imagination to form a clear picture of what we are as a self. For in this operation, the part would have to comprehend the whole. There is little hope of our ever being able to reach even approximate consciousness of the self. You can't ever be conscious of it. Since however much we may make conscious, there will always exist an indeterminate, right? It's indeterminate and indeterminable amount of unconscious material which belongs to the totality itself, right? So the essential nature of the self is it's going to be contradictory, indeterminate, and indeterminable. Hence, the self will always remain a supraordinate quality. You're never going to be able to consciously grasp it. Why? Because your mind is operating with reason and like determinate categories. In contrast to the traditional view, the absolute is itself irrational, indeterminate, and amoral. It is our consciousness which adds these features to the universe, right? We are the ones projecting rationality. We are the ones making determinacy, and we're the ones providing morality. It's up to us, right? So if there's this like this sense of like, oh, that old position, that's the Senex archetype, and that's all about like Saturn and responsibility and like the Roman ego, right? Bad. It's like it's much more liberating now. Like, well, really think of it. If you want like responsibility, like, do you want the responsibility to like live up to morality? Or do you want to be responsible for morality as such, right? There's a deep, deep sense of responsibility here. And I think it, in a sense, like at least feels to me even heavier on this model, right? It's all up to you, whether there's morality or not, whether there's reason or not, whether there's any determinacy or not. Jung claims, an archetype wants both good and bad. These categories do not exist in the Elfine realm. Bodily life as well as psychic life have the impudence to get along much better without conventional morality, and they often remain the healthier for it, right? So explicit, like he equates morality with conventional morality, and then not realizing there's like a philosophical concept of morality, and then says like, yeah, and we're better off without it oftentimes, right? In the archetypal world. He claims morality is essentially arbitrary and rests entirely on the moral sense of the individual and the freedom necessary for this. Right? So it's just going to be this arbitrary choice that determines moral norms. And we see this picture really clearly in a late letter he wrote, where he's talking at the end of his life about his position. And he says, I tried to find the best truth and clearest light I could attain to, since I have reached my highest point and can't transcend anymore. I am guarding my light and my treasure. It is most precious not only to me, but above all, to the darkness of the Creator, who needs man to illuminate his creation. It's us, it's man that provides the light. Right? If God had foreseen his world, it would be a mere senseless machine and man's existence a useless freak. Right? Again, this kind of truncating of the intellect, right? If God had known the world, it could only be known as a machine, because knowledge is only about cutting things up, right? And if the world is only a machine, then man would also be a machine. Humanity would be a machine, right? And then we're useless freak, right? All this stuff, all those like human qualities are gone. We're just robots, right? So you can see how these views kind of cluster. So God doesn't know, right? God doesn't know. We need to add the knowledge. If the universe is to be known, we add it. We add the light. My intellect can envisage the latter possibility, but my whole being says no to it, right? So on this position, the absolute is essentially darkness, indeterminate, amoral, and needs to manifest itself through us to know, right? To know, to have morality. These are things we add to the equation on this view. And some childhood background for Jung. This was a vision that was a long time in cooking. He had visions as a child, and he was raised in a fundamentalist kind of Christian home. I don't know about fundamentalists, but like in a Christian home where he was worried about blaspheming the Holy Spirit and going to hell, right? And this worries a lot of kids who grow up in like particular versions of Christianity. So he's there as a kid, he's like worried, like, if I think a wrong thought, am I blaspheming the Holy Spirit? Will I be damned forever? Is this blasphemy going to happen? And he obsesses about this for a while until finally he feels like, I need to let the vision happen. God wants me to let the vision happen. And then he sees it, he allows it to happen. And he sees like, I gathered all my courage as though I were to leap forthwith into hellfire and let the thought come. I saw before me the cathedral, the blue sky. God sits on his throne. It's a beautiful cathedral, God sitting on his throne in the heavens, high above the world, and from under the throne, an enormous turd falls upon the sparkling new roof, shatters it, and breaks the walls of the cathedral asunder, right? So like, what does this concept of the absolute do? It's a thing that like shits on our cathedrals, right? So the cathedrals need to be broken. The cathedrals need to be defiled, right? These two, it's this God, it's this kind of like shit throwing deity, right? That's like breaking things. That's the underlying vision that he's coming from. And from a classical perspective, this would be seen as like essentially desecratory, right? The core vision is desecratory. We can see this also in Jung's account of the Imitatio Christi, or the life of Christ, right? So Jung stresses that like a lot of religious people like put a lot of value in like what they believe about like Jesus or what Jesus did. And he says, but you also have to like live that way. That's important, right? You got to put equal amount of stress on like living a kind of sage-like life. I think that's right. Like he points that out. But then when he articulates what that sage-like life would be, he defines it as, well, it's a life that runs counter to the forces of the past, right? One where one acts as a kind of mad Bolshevist who deserves the cross, right? So what this kind of like noble sage life will be, it's going to be this kind of destructive thing. It's going to be the cathedral smashing kind of stuff. Okay. So we've got two contrasting metaphysical visions then. The absolute is goodness, truth, and beauty itself, reason emanating out of itself and infusing the universe with the logos, versus the absolute as the dark waters of the collective unconscious, both good and evil, both true and false, both beautiful and hideous, incapable of knowing itself because devoid of consciousness or reason. And you can see, like I noted at the beginning, like these look like they're fundamentally different pictures of absolute reality, right? And if you're going to orient a spiritual practice towards one or the other of these, it looks like you're going to be doing different stuff, right? And it's just important to like think through these differences. With this contrast in mind, one can begin to see why philosophers of a classical bent would suspect something infernal at work, right? So from a classical perspective, here's what an analysis might look like. And this is a good reflection by René Guénon. He says, there is certainly something more than a mere question of vocabulary in the fact, very significant in itself, that present-day psychology considers nothing but the subconscious, right? The Freudian subconscious, it's below the conscious, and never the superconscious, right? This transcendent world, the invisible world, the spiritual world, which ought logically to be its correlative. There is no doubt that this usage expresses the idea of an expression operating only in a downward direction. Remember the Hillman quote from the beginning, the soul's direction is always downward. That is toward the aspect of things that corresponds, both here in the human being and elsewhere in the cosmic environment, to the fissures through which the most malefic influences of the subtle world penetrate. Influences having a character that can truthfully and literally be called infernal. So things from below, right, going down. Since the domain of psychology is not extended upward, the superconscious naturally remains as strange to it and as cut off from it as ever. And when psychology happens to meet anything related to the superconscious, we see this in astrology a lot. So anything that like in the past was related to the spiritual realm, right, to this invisible spiritual realm, what it does, modern psychology does, is it tries to annex it merely by assimilating it to the subconscious. They'll be like, oh yeah, it's what Jung was saying, right? It was what Freud was saying. It's just the subconscious working itself out. This particular procedure is almost invariably characteristic of its so-called explanations of such things as religion and mysticism, right? We're going to get these radically different reinterpretation of religion and mysticism together with certain aspects of Eastern doctrines, such as yoga. So like whenever there are like coherent systems coming from other philosophical perspectives, this kind of like modern psychological approach tends to just like grab it and be like, oh yeah, it's just like Freud and Jung, right? Same vision, right? There are therefore features in this confusion of the superior with the inferior that can properly be regarded as constituting a real subversion, right? So they're claiming like they're using the same language of these like previous philosophical, metaphysical, or spiritual systems, but the meaning they're assigning to it flips it. It's completely opposite now, right? And yeah, I hope that in this talk it's been interesting and you've like at least like thinking about like whether these views are in fact identical or not, or whether there's differences. And if you do think there are differences, like which one you think is better, right? To think that through for yourself, which kind of spiritual practice you want. I've got some objections and replies, but I'll stop it there and bring them up if anybody, if they come up in question and answer. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Peter. That was so comprehensive. And, you stated that your objective at the beginning of this talk was to make clear these differences and conceptions of reality. And I do think that you have succeeded in that. All right. So there are some questions in the Q&A box. Would you prefer that I read them to you, or would you prefer to pull up the Q&A box and read them and see them and go through them yourself? Whichever you prefer.
Maybe reading them, it would feel more like a dialogue that way.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so Saffron asks, as there are many thoughts as there are grains of sand, is it possible that all theories are right and that we as individuals will choose the concepts that fit us personally and that will work during an interpretation?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Saffron. It depends on like how one cashes this out, right? So like you could also think of like that very scenario as like an equally appropriate like way of talking about that would be like, is it possible that all systems are equally wrong, right? Are they all equally wrong? Have they all like made contrasting claims of what the absolute is, and they don't work? The absolute isn't like what we thought it was, but any of these things were like, that's possible. And it's also possible, like if you want to think of it like in terms of like, in some sense true, you might think of like, well, there were elements of each of them that were right. If you like pull apart their views and like find some element in it, like maybe there's a super view that like subsumes them all, like one system to rule them all, and it brings them together, right? And in that way, like in a sense, like they were all aiming at the same truth, but we now have the greater vision that's gonna like connect them all. That's one thing I like about Hegel's philosophy is he's trying to do just that, like trying to show like how a whole could show how previous theories like got some things right and were like striving for something, but also like on their own terms were wrong, right? To get that balance in there.
Very ambitious of Hegel, right? From Dominic, could you please explain what the Hellenistic authors meant when they referred to the concept of reason/logos and how it may differ from modern concepts of reason?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think it's actually like tracking a core kind of distinction there. So as in that passage with Manilius, right, you can talk about like reason pulsates, right? Reason is alive. There's something about it that animates the universe, right? There's something about that process of reasoning that gets at the structure of reality, because reality itself is like rationally structured and rationally unfolding. And that reason can be motivated by the question of why, this kind of wonder at the world. Aristotle would say philosophy begins with a state of wonder, right? And this why is motivating to get at what Kant called the unconditioned, right? This answer to like this fundamental answer to like, why is the world as it is? What is this ultimate first principle? What is God or absolute reality? Like it's never going to be satisfied until it grasps that, until it like sees God somehow or sees the absolute somehow. This element of reason is like there in the Hellenistic tradition and in the classical tradition. But then in the modern tradition, it shifts. And now reason is just dissecting, right? Reason is just analysis. Reason is just subsuming things under determinate concepts, right? It's giving a scientific answer. It's making an algorithm. And in that case, you can start seeing like why modern astrologers are like, well, yeah, if it's intellectual, it's dead, right? It's not going to be a part of that like living spirit because you're just like cutting things up, because they've missed this other kind of richer conception of reason or this association with Mercury that's there in the classical tradition.
Earlier in your talk, you alluded to how the deconstruction of Mercury has been misused, the concept of deconstruction. Could you go into that a little bit and elaborate?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because it comes up in terms of like religious trauma as well. A lot of people will talk about like, I'm doing my deconstructive phase, right? So the worry here is that people use the term deconstruction in this popular sense. Usually it just means like rational analysis, right? Or critical reasoning, right? My faith was handed to me, or my cultural norms were handed to me. I hadn't thought about them before, but now I'm thinking it through. I want arguments for it. I want to think it through. You can think of, there's this famous passage at the beginning of Descartes' Meditations where he says, all the stuff I learned so far, it's like I've got a lot of false beliefs mixed in with it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scrap everything. I'm going to tear the whole house down, and I'm going to begin from the foundations. I'm going to build up for the foundations, right? So I'm going to rationally criticize everything. I'm going to build up from the foundations. My sense is that most people, when they're talking about deconstruction in a positive kind of sense, and like with this operation of Mercury, they're thinking of it in that way. The problem is that deconstruction was defined by Derrida precisely to oppose this kind of Cartesian model, right? So deconstruction wasn't supposed to be rational analysis, right? It's not rational critique, because the idea was that, well, reason presupposes certain kinds of norms and hierarchies, right? So you're going to think that it's better to be rational than irrational, right? And for Derrida, he wanted to say like, no, I want to upend everything, right? I want to upend all hierarchies. I don't want what he called this logocentrism. We have to get rid of it. So what he did with deconstruction was trying to develop a way of like criticizing beliefs that didn't use reason, right? So then he'd like call attention to the margins of pages, right? Or to like invent little puns on words and plays on words, or call attention to something else that was going on at the time, or like bring two texts into like typographical dialogue with each other, where you've got one text here and one text here, and it makes you like see them and think of them, but it's not in terms of a rational argument, right? So then deconstruction would be the way of like tearing things apart and tearing down systems that's not rational, that's in fact anti-rational, right? That sets itself as antithetically opposed to rationality. So it could be that Mercury can get those associations too, when we think of him like in terms of like trickery or thievery or something, that you might be able to do it in that way. But it's just, I think at like the popular level of discourse, there's this confusion between critical rational inquiry, which Mercury does, and this other kind of like strictly deconstructive kind of critique that's not rational.
I see. Thank you, Peter. We have a question from Jessica Tiemann, who gave a talk last weekend. She says, love this talk. Curious how the content of this presentation for you relates directly to the psychopomp significations of Mercury.
Yeah, I like it because, like, at least personally, I like this idea of like when we go through change or transition, right? When there's a crisis in our lives or something, a lot of times what happens is our intellectual structures, our meaning-making practices have fallen apart, or like, we're involved with an abusive relationship or something, and we're completely engulfed by that, and our way of interpreting reality was one way, and then it ends, and you distance yourself, and you're like, okay, what world am I now? How am I going to interpret things now? And this idea of like, I'm now like occupying another world. I'm occupying another kind of like interpretive framework here. And that Mercury, by like reason, can like help us as our guide through that, as we like reason through the places where we were before, if we're like changing our views of culture or changing our views of relationship or changing our views of religion, right? It's like Mercury's always there with us to guide us as we think things through, as we reason things out. Yeah, thanks. That's a good question.
Okay, next question from Deborah. Your perspective would suggest that we need to revisit in the classical condition whether Mercury is in its fall in Sagittarius. How did the reduction of Mercury to small analysis occur? Was it truly the modern perspective that is guilty of this reductionism?
Yeah. So I could see someone, I mean, this is something that's come up in class before in our discussion where I think it's Rhetorius. He contrasts Jupiter with Mercury. Right? There's an opposition there. And there's something you pointed out, Delia, that I really liked. That was, if we look at the literal passage right there, Rhetorius tells us literally what the contrast is. And the contrast is Jupiter gives you a lot of good stuff. Like he's going to get like a lot of food on the table. And the pleasures of the intellectual activity isn't going to happen where you're like eating a bunch of stuff and feasting, right? The philosopher is going to like pull himself or herself out of that and be thinking of things. So there is that contrast there. But in the classical tradition, it tended to be because they ended up, or at least Rhetorius ended up identifying the benefics with like the purely physical realm. Not it's different than this way that like there's a philosophical extrapolation from that where some argue that like, well, no, it's because there's this contrast because Jupiter is like the big holistic like grasping of the system, whereas Mercury is this little part there, the analysis kind of thing. So I'd argue that this kind of argument is textually unfounded because the texts that we literally have are just talking about these physical kind of aspects that you were talking about. And then I additionally, again, point to the significations that we can find in Valens, where he's identifying with the logos, with phronesis, with pedagogy, and with philosophy itself, and with astrology, all of which are attempts to grasp the whole. Right. So my argument there would be like, no, it's grounded in the classical tradition. Some people want to argue that it's not in the classical tradition, but they're misrepresenting the textual evidence for that. Thanks.
A question from William. This seems to relate to whether one's life has a purpose versus one's life is what one makes it. I think the Greeks had the notion that each person had a daimon that was their promise, and their goal was to embody it, to realize it. But the modern view is that you get to define it the way you want to, which is like Jung, feels like a rebellion against forcing a worldview down your throat. Would love to hear you address this since it's so fundamental to how one interprets a chart.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it does get at something really important and kind of like a key to our zeitgeist, right? So like when you think of Sartre's popularization of existentialism and existentialism as a humanism, right? Where he's like, what is existentialism? And existentialism says, for humanity, existence precedes essence, right? For everything else, essence precedes existence. For us, existence precedes essence. What do you mean by that? And so like he'll use examples like, I've got a pen, it's been manufactured for a certain purpose, right? It's got a purpose to write with, right? And is made. There's a certain kind of like mechanical schema that's used, and it's going to determine the ends of the thing, right? And Sartre says like, humans aren't like that. We're not manufactured in that way. We'd be robots. Again, it's like this kind of like robot argument. Like we actually have free will and can make choices, right? We can determine things. We're not like manufactured items. So because of that, our existence, our being as particular individuals precedes our essence. We have to figure out what it is we're supposed to be doing, right? It's not just given to us like in a factory, right? So that is a key contrast. But I'd say like what's left out on this model is that you can think of meaning and purpose, as we saw earlier, not in terms of a factory making stuff, right? It's not mechanical. It can be that the logos permeates everything, that things have an essential structure, and that we have choices in how to develop it, all the while noting that we're different than fabricated objects, right? So, for example, right, if we want to take that case of not having views shoved down our throats, which can be an advantage of this kind of like more existentialist kind of approach. You can account for that same phenomenon within the classical model by noting that like people's claims about what you should do aren't necessarily true, right? So what the religious institutions or society or your parents told you human nature is and you should be doing isn't necessarily true. And your job as an individual responsible agent is to think things through, to use reason for yourself and figure out what the true nature of reality is, right? So you still get the self-differentiation and self-development, but it's in terms of exercising reason, right? Exercising reason and like how you want to develop yourself. Or again, I'm thinking in terms of, it's not Ficino, it's Pico della Mirandola when he talks about his oration on the dignity of man. And he gives a similar account to like what the existentialists would say, like all these other essences in the great chain of being, they've got this determinate thing, but humanity, what's great about humanity is it's got free will. You can choose whether to act like the angels and ascend and live that kind of life, or you can be like a worm, right? You can like, be like, live a physical life. It's up to you, right? But this occurred within the classical model still of the great chain of being, where there's still a hierarchy of stuff, and you've got a genuine choice, like of what direction you want your life to go in and how you want to determine your human nature, right? But it's within this determinate structure, and there's a hierarchy in this structure where it's like, at least on my point of view, like learning compassion and trying to be conscious and trying to be caring are better values for humanity than like getting power over people or like getting a lot of applause or getting a reputation, right? That there's a hierarchy there, or satisfying your physical needs or physical pleasures, right? That there's a hierarchy, and that our choice occurs in like which of those we want. And then like we can self-differentiate in terms of like the rational process of like thinking through which one of them is best. And we can disagree about it. Like maybe someone would say like, no, pleasure is the good, right? And we can have a debate there. Yeah, good question.
Next question is from Nadav. Isn't Jung's view of the persona being separate from the ego or the individual actually in line with the ancient belief in the soul being realer and more eternal than the world of karma and the incarnate personality?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it could be, but it seems like it's a different level of analysis, right? So you could say that there's this unseen spiritual world. In itself, there's like your soul before it's incarnated, or like in a previous incarnation, or ultimately like the grounds of your soul, which is like God, right? If you want to take like a Meister Eckhart kind of view, where it's like the eye which I see is the same eye with which God sees me, right? That there's this connection there at this like super mundane level, at the level of absolute grounding, where none of this is like adequately characterizing it. This is just like one determinate mode of that. There are like a lot, you need the entire chain of being to fully express the totality of God. In that sense, it's right. But the difference is that like when we're talking about a determinate incarnation, so now I'm not talking like astrology. I think Kachuda's mentioned this in the class before, and I agree that like the natal chart itself, like none of that is talking about that eternal aspect of soul, right? None of that is talking about that. This is talking about like soul qua determinate entity. So now if we're talking about the idea of a soul qua determinate entity, the difference is going to come in that the classical view is going to be like, yeah, that's a thing, right? Your life, this incarnate life now is going to have a determinate structure, and there's going to be reason and responsibility in that. Whereas the Jungian view, or at least how it's adopted by some astrologers, is going to be like, yeah, there's the determinate structure, but like in this incarnate life now, right? In this empirical manifestation now, what's inside you can't ever be realized, right? Because it's this indeterminate mess of emotions, right? You can't ever be adequately captured. Yeah, thanks. Good question.
Question from Tamara. If we accept that all material reality expresses a rational, eternal spirit, which is absolutely good, wise, and powerful, taking the premise of Hegel's notion of historical progression, which consists of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and then naming ancient views of the ascendant and chart interpretation as the thesis with modern astrology as the antithesis, do you think that synthesis is possible or desirable? And if so, what synthesis do you suggest is possible?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't want to. It aligns closely with my own kind of ambitious views. So, like, this is going to be just like my take on it. But yeah, I think there is something to this, such a kind of line where, like, in the ancient world, like, there was this rich philosophical use for astrology, but there were aspects of the chart interpretation where a lot of it does seem like it's acting like it's like talking about like physical stuff that's going to happen, like just physical things. So it is kind of like aspect to it where it seems like it's like talking about like this more the externally kind of stuff, the externally events of the life. Then in the modern period, and we can think of this as like, instead of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, we can think of it like the in itself, for itself, and in and for itself. You might think that a shift happened, and then like astrology in this modern turn was like, no, it's all about psychology. It's about experience, right? It's going to say a lot about like our way of interpreting reality and the kind of structures that are useful there. And in that case, like, you might argue that like something's gained in that. Could we start using this language to say more about the structure of experience, qua human experience, and not focus so much on like external events, qua external events, but more like interpretation of events? That could be right. Where it's wrong, I think, is that they use the framework of modern psychoanalysis in order to do that. So if we could bridge the two together in what I call a phenomenological astrology, you'd be talking about the essential structures of human experience, but using that kind of spiritual philosophical framework to it. So not a kind of like Jungian and Freudian framework for experience, but something more like using like Heidegger or Husserl or even Hegel himself. So you get this kind of like rich conceptual structure, but also have it keyed to human experience, qua experience. And I think this would also mesh well with Mercury being the kind of patron planet for astrology, that it's its interpretive endeavor. So again, that's just my own personal musings on that.
Next question is from Whitney Fishburne. Regarding the two worldviews where the unhinging of the life from the determinate point, and so the point, we are then left only with relationships based on power. I see this as being left with only hierarchy, which in society has been manifested as extreme capitalism, where everything is focused on the capita, the head. Thus, we are always forced upward, but not to what is around us. It separates us from ourselves and from one another. I've always attributed this destructive, non-regenerative state of being on our being the descendants of the Roman Empire. So what you're saying is that Plato did not despise hierarchy, but saw it as part of the whole. And how then do we look to astrology, and especially classical astrology, as a way to help repair the damage of a linear-only approach?
Yeah. And I think you get a good point that like it's like confused in the popular discourse where it's like there are like horrible like hierarchies that have been enacted in history precisely because it's these like power relations, right? It's like this dominant hierarchy. Who's going to be on the top? Who's going to get other people to like make stuff for them, right? And that capitalism can like exacerbate this situation and like have a certain kind of power structure to it. But we can also note that in the classical world, there were different conceptions of hierarchy, right? Where it's like, if there's a metaphysical view where being is more fundamental than becoming, right? Or that spirit is somehow more fundamental than the stuff you get, right? That this itself is a certain kind of hierarchy, but can be used in order to question these kind of power relations, right? It can be the very kind of like basis for resistance to oppressive systems, right? But it itself like entails a hierarchy. It's just a different kind than people thought about before. As for like how to use astrology, I don't have particular answers to that. I like Achuda's approach when I'm like, I think it's really profound when he says like, you use it as a spiritual practice, right? The main thing is that if it can help us become spiritual and become conscious, like that's the first step, and then everything else will like kind of come from there. Like that's the needed thing. So I don't have like particular ways in which like astrology can give a new society that's not structured according to like capitalism or something in that order, or just the raw acquisitiveness. But I do think there's something to like whatever it's going to be like looking to our spiritual core and like looking to develop our consciousness somehow, and then working together in that way, like we'll hopefully come up with something. Yeah, that's a good question.
Right. So unfortunately, there are more questions than we have time to get through today, but thank you everyone for contributing your questions, and Peter for your very thoughtful answers. So Peter, I'm going to stop your screen sharing just to bring up the Nightlight website once again. And with this talk, we conclude the winter speaker series. So once again, the talks that we had, you can find here. The replay of this weekend's talks by Cassandra and this talk by Peter will be available here. You'll find a little replay link beginning on Monday, and that will be available for 7 days. And if you would like to find out more about Peter, his work, etc., here you can go to his website. He offers different types of counseling and consulting, which you can check out here. And some of your writing as well, right?
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wonderful. So thank you so much, Peter. This has been a very enjoyable talk, and I'm so glad.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. And thank you also, everyone, for joining us. And I hope that you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.